The satellite phone crackled to life in the middle of the Amazon rainforest, miles from any known civilization. Marcus Chen stared at the impossible message. The girl is 3 miles northeast. Follow the white stones. There was no return number, no explanation. Just like the other 7 messages that had led him to missing persons, everyone else had given up for dead. Marcus was no ordinary search and rescue specialist. 5 years ago, he'd been Brother Marcus, a missionary who'd walked away from his calling after a tragedy that still haunted his dreams. Now he used those same jungle survival skills to find the lost, for money, not faith. But these mysterious messages were different. Each rescue felt orchestrated, as if someone was walking ahead of him, preparing the way. The white stones appeared exactly where promised, glowing faintly in the fading daylight. As Marcus followed the trail deeper into uncharted territory, he couldn't shake the feeling that this time he wasn't just being led to save someone else. He was walking toward his own reckoning. But who was sending these messages, and how did they always know exactly where to find the lost? He shouldered his pack and checked his compass. Northeast, always precise, these messages. Never head toward the big tree or near the river bend. Coordinates that led him through impossible terrain to find people who shouldn't have survived. Like Elena Rodriguez, the botanist who'd been missing for 3 weeks. The search teams had found her camp torn apart by jaguars, blood everywhere, her equipment scattered. But the message had led Marcus to a hidden cave system where she'd been trapped with a broken leg, surviving on underground springs and mushrooms. She'd sworn she heard a voice calling her to the caves just before the attack. Or Tommy Fitzgerald, the oil company surveyor who'd vanished during a storm. His helicopter had gone down in an area so remote that even the Brazilian military couldn't reach it. But Marcus had followed the cryptic directions through treacherous swampland and found Tommy building a raft, claiming he'd been having dreams about which direction to go. The pattern was always the same. The message would arrive just as Marcus finished his previous case. Always someone who'd been given up for dead. Always someone who spoke of voices, dreams, or inexplicable urges that had kept them alive. The first white stone sat nestled between the buttress roots of a massive cecropia tree. Marcus had learned not to question how these markers appeared in places where human feet rarely tread. Smooth river rocks, pale as bones, placed with deliberate care along paths that seemed to materialize from nowhere. He'd tried tracking the signal sources, hiring tech specialists to trace the messages. Nothing. The texts simply appeared on his satellite phone as if generated by the device itself. He'd even replaced the phone twice, thinking it was malfunctioning. The messages kept coming. The jungle grew denser as he followed the stone trail. Vines, thick as telephone cables, draped between trees that hadn't seen direct sunlight in decades. Marcus moved carefully, reading the forest's mood. The usual chorus of birds and insects had gone quiet, never a good sign. Something was watching. The second stone lay beside a fallen log, crawling with termites. Marcus paused to drink water and check his GPS. According to his maps, he was entering a region marked only as unexplored territory. Even the indigenous tribes avoided this area, claiming it was cursed. But Marcus had stopped believing in curses the night he'd lost his faith. The night he'd prayed harder than ever before and watched 12 children die anyway. If God existed, he wasn't interested in answering prayers. Yet these messages kept coming, leading him to miracle after miracle. The contradiction ate at him. How could someone with no faith keep finding the lost when trained professionals couldn't? How could his dead prayers be answered while his living ones had been ignored? The third white stone sat in a clearing where the canopy opened just enough to let in shafts of golden light. Marcus could hear running water nearby, unusual for this elevation. As he knelt to examine the stone, he noticed something that made his blood freeze. A small cross had been scratched into the rock's surface. His hand instinctively moved to his throat, feeling for the chain that no longer hung there. He'd thrown his own cross into a river 5 years ago, watching it disappear beneath muddy water, along with his collar and his faith. The satellite phone buzzed again. Marcus grabbed it, his hands shaking slightly. She's waiting by the waterfall. But this time, Marcus, you need to remember why you came here first. The message made no sense. He'd come here following the previous text. There was no first time. But as he stared at the words, a memory stirred. Something buried so deep he'd convinced himself it was just another nightmare. A flash of recognition hit him like a physical blow. The clearing, the angle of light through the trees, the sound of distant water. He'd been here before, 5 years ago. The last night he'd worn his collar, the night everything went wrong. The message arrived 3 days after Marcus buried Sarah Chen's case file in his desk drawer. He'd found her alive in that Bangkok warehouse, just as the voice had promised, but the haunted look in her eyes told him rescue was only the beginning of her real journey. The manila envelope bore no return address, only his name written in the same careful script he'd seen before. Inside, a single photograph showed a middle-aged man with kind eyes and calloused hands standing beside a well in what appeared to be an African village. On the back, someone had written, Dr. James Whitmore. Last seen Eritrea border. Time is running short. Marcus studied the image under his desk lamp, noting the medical supplies scattered around the well, the children watching from a safe distance. Another missionary, probably. Another good man swallowed by the world's indifference. He should walk away, should stick to insurance fraud and cheating spouses, cases where the worst thing he'd face was a camera flash and an angry spouse. But the voice had been right about Sarah Chen, and about the warehouse guard who would fall asleep at exactly 2:17 a.m., and about which corridor to take when the building's alarm system mysteriously failed for precisely 4 minutes. His laptop chimed with an incoming call. Marcus hesitated before accepting the video chat from Father Miguel Santos, his former supervisor at the mission in Sao Paulo. Miguel's weathered face filled the screen, concern etched in the lines around his eyes. Marcus, my friend, I have been trying to reach you. I've been busy. Marcus moved the photograph out of the webcam's view. What do you need, Miguel? It's not what I need. It is what I fear. Miguel leaned closer to his camera. There have been inquiries about you, from people who should not know where to look. The coffee in Marcus's mouth turned bitter. What kind of inquiries? The dangerous kind. Men with expensive suits asking about your time here, your work in the favelas. They knew things, Marcus, details about the night you left. Marcus's hand instinctively moved to his shoulder, where the scar tissue still pulled tight when the weather changed. 5 years since that night in the Villa Madalena slum. 5 years since he'd learned that some evils wore the masks of angels. And still, the memories could surface without warning. What did you tell them? Nothing useful. But Marcus, they are not the first. There have been others over the years, always asking the same questions. Someone is looking for you very carefully, very patiently. The photograph of Dr. Whitmore seemed to pulse with urgency under the desk lamp. Marcus wondered if this was how chess pieces felt when moved across the board, aware of motion but blind to the player's strategy. I need to ask you something, Marcus said. Do you believe God speaks through mysterious ways? Miguel's expression softened. Of course. But why do you ask? Someone has been guiding me to missing people, sending me information, helping me find them. But I don't know who or why or what they want from me. And you think this guidance is divine? I think it's the only explanation that doesn't make me completely insane. Miguel was quiet for a long moment, his fingers working the rosary beads that never left his wrist. Marcus, in our work, we learned that miracles rarely come without cost. If you are truly being guided, you must ask yourself, guided toward what? After the call ended, Marcus sat in his apartment's growing darkness, watching the city lights flicker to life beyond his window. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Flight 487 to Asmara departs in 6 hours. Seat 14C reserved. He should ignore it, should pack his things and disappear into some small town where former missionaries could run hardware stores and sleep peacefully. But Dr. Whitmore's face stared up at him from the photograph, and Marcus knew that somewhere in the Horn of Africa, a good man was running out of time. The voice in his head, or whatever it was, had never led him astray, but Miguel's warning echoed, guided toward what? As he pulled his travel bag from the closet, Marcus tried to remember the last time he'd made a decision entirely his own. The choices felt increasingly like steps in a dance whose choreography he couldn't see, leading him deeper into a mystery that seemed to have been waiting for him long before he knew it existed. His passport was still valid, his vaccinations were current, and somewhere in Eritrea, Dr. James Whitmore was probably praying for rescue from a man he'd never met, guided by a voice that might be divine providence or something far more dangerous. Marcus zipped his bag closed and headed for the door, stepping once again into the path that had been laid before him by forces he neither understood nor could resist. The radio crackled to life at 3:47 a.m., jolting Marcus from his restless sleep on the narrow cot in his Sao Paulo office. Static filled the room before a voice emerged, distorted, barely human, yet unmistakably familiar in its strange cadence. The girl with the butterfly tattoo walks toward the river at dawn. Follow the morning star. Marcus sat up, his heart hammering against his ribs. 3 weeks had passed since he'd found Elena Vasquez alive in that Bogotá warehouse, guided by similar cryptic messages that had led him through Colombia's most dangerous neighborhoods with impossible precision. The local police had written off her disappearance as another casualty of the drug trade, but somehow those mysterious transmissions had directed him straight to her location. He grabbed his notebook and scribbled down the message, his hand trembling slightly. The voice never identified itself, never explained how it obtained his radio frequency, and never responded to his attempts at communication. It simply delivered coordinates disguised as riddles, then vanished into electromagnetic silence. His laptop screen cast a blue glow across the cluttered office as he pulled up missing persons reports from across South America. There, buried in a 3-day-old file from the Brazilian Federal Police, was mention of a 17-year-old girl named Isabella Santos, who had disappeared from a riverfront favela in Manaus. The report mentioned a distinctive butterfly tattoo on her left shoulder. Marcus's blood chilled. How could the voice have known about details not yet released to the public? He'd never been to Manaus, had no contacts in the Amazon basin, yet somehow he was being summoned there with the same inexplicable certainty that had guided his previous rescues. The flight to Manaus departed at noon, giving him barely enough time to pack his essential gear: satellite phone, medical supplies, cash in 3 different currencies, and the small leather Bible his father had given him before his first mission to Honduras 15 years ago. He'd stopped believing in divine providence long before his fall from grace, but lately these mysterious interventions felt disturbingly similar to answered prayers. The Amazon sprawled endlessly beneath the plane's wings, a green ocean broken only by the muddy serpentine curves of countless rivers. Marcus pressed his face against the window, searching for some sign of the morning star mentioned in the message, but daylight had long since erased the stellar map from the sky. At Manaus International, he hired a local guide named Roberto, a weathered man in his 50s, whose English carried the melodic accent of someone equally comfortable in Portuguese and the indigenous languages of the deep forest. Roberto's eyes narrowed when Marcus mentioned searching for a missing girl near the river. "Many girls go missing here, senor. The jungle, she takes what she wants and rarely gives back. You sure you want to look for ghosts?" They loaded supplies into Roberto's aluminum boat as the sun began its descent toward the tree line. The Rio Negro stretched before them like black glass, its surface disturbed only by the occasional leap of a pink river dolphin or the prehistoric eyes of a caiman watching from the shallows. "Where exactly are we going?" Roberto asked as he guided them away from the floating docks. Marcus consulted his compass, then pointed northeast toward a cluster of ramshackle houses built on stilts along the water's edge. "Start with the settlements upstream. We're looking for anyone who might have seen a teenage girl with a butterfly tattoo." Roberto's expression darkened. "That area, it belongs to Joaquim Carrera. He doesn't like visitors asking questions about missing girls. The name sent recognition racing through Marcus's memory. Joaquim Carrera, wanted by Interpol for human trafficking, last reported operating somewhere in the Amazon basin. Another connection too precise to be coincidental. As they approached the first settlement, Marcus noticed children playing in dugout canoes, their laughter echoing across the water. But the adults watched their approach with suspicious eyes, and several men emerged from the wooden structures carrying rifles with casual familiarity. Roberto cut the engine 50 meters from shore. "Maybe we should turn back, Senor. These people, they don't trust strangers." Before Marcus could respond, his satellite phone chirped with an incoming message. "No sender ID, just coordinates and a single line of text. The butterfly seeks shelter in the White House. Beware the man with scarred hands." Marcus scanned the settlement until he spotted it. A single structure painted white among the weathered brown buildings, partially hidden behind a stand of cecropia trees. And there, standing on its front porch, was a large man whose hands bore the distinctive scarring of old machete wounds. "There," Marcus pointed. "That's where we need to go." Roberto shook his head but started the engine anyway. "You're either very brave or very stupid, Senor. In the Amazon, the difference usually doesn't matter much." As they approached the dock, Marcus caught a glimpse of movement in the White House's upper window, a flash of dark hair and what might have been a desperate face pressed against the glass. The mysterious voice had guided him true once again, but this time he could feel invisible eyes watching from the forest, calculating his every move. The satellite phone crackled to life at 3 in the morning, dragging Marcus from restless sleep. He'd been dreaming of Sierra again, her face dissolving into jungle mist, her voice calling his name from somewhere he couldn't reach. "Another one," came Detective Rodriguez's weary voice through the static. "Girl named Elena Vasquez, 19, disappeared 4 days ago near the Peruvian border. Family's desperate." Marcus sat up on his motel bed, running fingers through graying hair. "What makes you think I can help?" "Because someone specifically asked for you. Left your name and number at 3 different police stations along the border. Said you'd know what to do." The familiar chill ran down Marcus's spine. It had been the same with Sarah Chen. Anonymous tips, his name whispered in the right ears. Breadcrumbs, leading him exactly where he needed to go, where someone wanted him to go. "Send me everything," he said. 2 hours later, Marcus stood in the pre-dawn darkness of Puerto Maldonado's tiny airport, studying Elena's photograph. She had Sarah's defiant eyes, that same mixture of intelligence and stubborn independence that probably got her into trouble. The kind of girl who'd follow a story or a cause straight into danger. She was working with an environmental group. Rodriguez's voice echoed from their phone conversation, documenting illegal mining operations. Last anyone heard, she was heading upriver with a local guide named Joaquin. The charter plane ride into the Amazon basin felt like descending into another world. Marcus pressed his face to the window, watching the endless green canopy unfold below. Somewhere in that vast wilderness, Elena was either fighting for her life or already lost. The voice came as they began their descent, not through his earpiece this time, but somehow deeper, resonating in his chest like a tuning fork struck against bone. "Follow the scarred tree. Trust the woman with painted hands." Marcus gripped his seat, looking around to see if anyone else had heard. The pilot continued his radio chatter, oblivious. This was new. The voice had never come without technology before, never felt so present. The landing strip was little more than a cleared patch of dirt beside the Rio Madre de Dios. A handful of buildings clustered along the muddy bank, and dugout canoes bobbed in the brown water. Marcus gathered his gear, checking his GPS device, water purification tablets, and the Glock he hoped he wouldn't need. "You're the American looking for the girl." Marcus turned to find a woman watching him from the shade of a corrugated metal hanger. She was perhaps 40, with weathered features and intricate blue patterns painted across her hands and forearms. The designs seemed to shift in the dappled light. "Elena Vasquez," he confirmed, studying her painted skin. "You know something?" I know many things. I am Yara. She gestured toward the forest. The spirits are restless. They whisper of strangers who take what doesn't belong to them. The mining operation? Yara's dark eyes held his. Not just gold, Mr. Cross. Some things buried in the earth should stay buried. Some voices should not be awakened. The way she said his name sent ice through his veins. He hadn't introduced himself. How do you know who I am? The same way you knew to trust me. She nodded toward his right hand, which had unconsciously moved to his chest, where the voice had resonated. You hear it too, don't you? The calling? Marcus felt the world shift slightly, like standing on a boat in swells. What's happening to me? The question, Yara said, walking toward a weathered canoe, is what happened to you before. What did you do in these forests 20 years ago that opened you to the voices? 20 years ago. The missionary years he'd tried so hard to forget. The village that had welcomed him with such hope. The faith he'd carried like armor into the green heart of the Amazon. The night everything went wrong and he'd fled, leaving more than his calling behind. I don't know what you're talking about. Then perhaps you will remember as we go deeper. Yara settled into the stern of the canoe, her painted hands gripping a paddle carved with symbols that hurt to look at directly. Elena went upriver 3 days ago. Her guide Joaquin returned alone, speaking of spirits and shadows. He will not go back. Marcus climbed into the canoe, feeling the current grab them immediately. But you will. I will take you to the scarred tree. What you find there depends on what you're willing to remember. As they moved into the current, Marcus caught sight of something that made his blood freeze. On the far bank, partially hidden by hanging vines, stood a wooden cross. Crude, handmade, exactly like the ones he'd carved for grave markers 2 decades ago. The voice whispered again, clearer now. Welcome home, Marcus. We've been waiting. The radio crackled to life at 3 in the morning, jerking Marcus awake from restless dreams filled with echoing footsteps and whispered prayers. He fumbled for the device in the darkness of his Sao Paulo apartment, his hand instinctively reaching for the cross that no longer hung around his neck. Marcus Chen. His voice came out rough, thick with sleep and the remnants of nightmares he couldn't quite shake. Static filled the line for several heartbeats before a woman's voice broke through, trembling and desperate. Mr. Chen? My name is Elena Vasquez. I got your number from the police. They said you might help when they can't. Marcus sat up, switching on the bedside lamp. The harsh light revealed case files scattered across his nightstand. 3 successful rescues in as many months, each one guided by that inexplicable voice that had first spoken to him in Belém. He grabbed a pen and notepad, a habit from his missionary days, when late-night calls often brought news of emergencies. Tell me what happened, Mrs. Vasquez. It's my brother, Roberto. He's a documentary filmmaker, was working on some project about indigenous communities in Roraima state near the Venezuelan border. Her words tumbled out in a rush. He missed his scheduled check-in 3 days ago. The local authorities say they can't spare resources for a search in that area, too dangerous with all the illegal mining operations. Marcus scribbled notes, his investigative instincts kicking in despite the early hour. Roraima was a different beast entirely from his previous cases. A lawless frontier where environmental activists and journalists disappeared with alarming regularity. The kind of place where his former calling as a missionary had taught him to fear the darkness that men could carry in their hearts. When was his last communication? 6 days ago. He sent coordinates to his research assistant, said he'd found something important. Something about the Yanomami people and their relationship with certain mining executives. Elena's voice broke slightly. Mr. Chen, Roberto is all I have left. Our parents died in a car accident last year, and he's been reckless since then, taking bigger risks with his work. Marcus closed his eyes, recognizing the familiar weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. Each case since Belém had followed the same pattern. Desperate families, impossible circumstances, and that inexplicable inner compass that had never steered him wrong. Yet he couldn't shake the feeling that these weren't random coincidences, that something was orchestrating these encounters. I'll need everything you have on Roberto's project. Contact information for his research assistant, copies of his notes, anything that might indicate who he was planning to interview. I have all of that. And Mr. Chen? Elena paused. I can pay your fee, whatever it is. I liquidated my savings account yesterday. We'll discuss payment later, Marcus said, though money had become secondary to understanding why these cases kept finding him. Can you meet me this afternoon? I need to see those files in person. After ending the call, Marcus stood at his apartment window, looking out at the sleeping city. Sao Paulo stretched endlessly before him, millions of lights forming constellations of human ambition and struggle. Somewhere beyond this urban maze, past hundreds of miles of jungle and political chaos, another person waited in darkness. The voice that had guided him to Maria Santos, then to the kidnapped businessman in Manaus, and later to the missing conservationist in Accra, remained silent now. But Marcus had learned to recognize its absence as much as its presence. The quiet before guidance came always carried its own weight, like the atmospheric pressure that builds before a thunderstorm. He walked to his desk and pulled out a detailed map of Roraima State, spreading it across the surface littered with coffee-stained case reports. The border region with Venezuela was a patchwork of indigenous territories, national parks, and disputed mining claims. Drug traffickers used the area as a corridor, while environmental groups battled illegal gold operations that poisoned rivers with mercury. His finger traced potential routes into the interior, each path presenting its own constellation of dangers. Marcus had learned enough Portuguese to navigate bureaucratic obstacles, but this case would likely require indigenous guides and serious diplomatic preparation, the kind of expedition that could easily become a one-way journey. As dawn broke over the city, Marcus found himself studying his reflection in the window glass. The face looking back bore new lines around the eyes, weathered by months of pursuing the impossible. His crisis of faith had morphed into something else entirely, not belief or disbelief, but a willingness to follow mystery wherever it led. The phone rang again, and this time Marcus recognized the caller ID, Detective Santos from Belém, the officer who had first pointed him toward private investigation work. Marcus, my friend, Santos's familiar voice carried concern. I heard you might be taking a case in Roraima. I need to warn you about something. Marcus felt that familiar stirring in his chest, the sensation that always preceded the voice's guidance. The game, whatever it was about to change again. The riverboat's engine coughed to life as dawn painted the Amazon in shades of copper and gold. Marcus stood at the bow, watching the endless wall of green slide past, while the cryptic message burned in his memory: the children wait where the three waters meet. Follow the scarred Cicropia, trust the silence between heartbeats. Captain Vasco emerged from the wheelhouse, his weathered face grim. You sure about this heading, gringo? That territory, it has a reputation. What kind of reputation? Vasco spat into the muddy water. Stories, missionaries who went in and came out speaking in tongues about angels with burning eyes, loggers who abandoned their equipment and walked into the jungle, never to return. The locals call it Terra dos Sussurros, land of whispers. Marcus felt something cold settle in his stomach. 20 years ago, he'd led a small mission team into these same waters. Only he had emerged, carrying tales of fever dreams and indigenous shamans that the church had quietly buried along with his ministry. How long to reach the confluence? 2 days if the river spirits are kind. Vasco's eyes held a warning, but spirits here, they remember old debts. The morning passed in relative quiet, broken only by the distant calls of howler monkeys and the splash of river dolphins surfacing near their wake. Marcus tried to focus on the missing children, 3 siblings from a research station that had gone silent 2 weeks ago, but his thoughts kept drifting to memories he'd spent decades suppressing. Dr. Sarah Chen approached, her field notebook clutched against her chest. The botanist had insisted on joining the expedition, claiming the children's parents were colleagues. The vegetation is changing, she said, pointing toward the shoreline. These species shouldn't exist together. It's like different ecosystems are merging. Marcus followed her gaze and spotted something that made his breath catch. A massive cecropia tree leaned over the water, its trunk bearing diagonal scars that looked almost deliberate, as if someone or something had marked it as a waypoint. There, he pointed. That's our landmark. Dr. Chen squinted at the scarred bark. Those markings, they're not natural, but they're old, decades old. The boat turned toward a narrow tributary, and immediately the temperature dropped. The jungle pressed closer, creating a living tunnel of green shadows. Marcus heard it then, the subtle wrongness in the natural symphony. Where there should have been countless bird calls, insects and rustling leaves, there were gaps. Pockets of silence that seemed to pulse with their own rhythm. Trust, the silence between heartbeats. "Cut the engine," Marcus called out. Vasco looked back in alarm. "Here, the current will cut it." In the sudden quiet, Marcus closed his eyes and listened. The silence wasn't empty. It was full of intention. It pulled them forward, down a channel so narrow the canopy blocked out the sun entirely. Vines brushed against the boat's sides like probing fingers. Dr. Chen gasped. "Do you see that?" Ahead, the waterway opened into a hidden lagoon where 3 separate streams converged. At the center sat a small island, and on it, the ruins of a structure that made Marcus's blood freeze. Wooden posts and corrugated metal, overtaken by vegetation, but still recognizable as the remains of a mission station. His mission station. "That's impossible," he whispered. "It burned. I watched it burn." But there it was, exactly as he remembered, down to the hand-carved cross that still clung to what remained of the chapel wall. And sitting beneath that cross, very much alive, were 3 children. As their boat approached the island, Marcus noticed something else that shouldn't have existed: footprints in the mud, fresh ones, leading from the water's edge to where the children waited. But the prints weren't human. They were too long, with marks that suggested claws, and they glowed with a faint phosphorescence in the dim light. The oldest child, a girl of perhaps 12, stood as they beached the boat. Her eyes held an unnatural calm. "We've been waiting for you, Marcus Holloway," she said in perfect English, though her parents were Brazilian researchers. "The voice said you would come." Dr. Chen grabbed Marcus's arm. "How does she know your name? How does she know any of this?" But Marcus was staring at the ruins behind the children, remembering the night 20 years ago when everything had gone wrong. When he'd first heard the voice that now guided his steps, when he'd made a choice that had damned or saved him, he'd never been sure which. The girl tilted her head, listening to something only she could hear. "It says to tell you the debt comes due at sunset. It says you understand." The jungle around them held its breath, and in that perfect silence between one heartbeat and the next, Marcus realized he wasn't here to rescue these children. He was here to pay for the ones he'd failed to save. The radio crackled to life at 3 in the morning, jerking Marcus from the first decent sleep he'd had in weeks. Static filled his cramped hotel room in Letitia, punctuated by a voice that made his blood run cold. "You cannot run from what you've done, Marcus." The accent was unmistakably American, but distorted by the poor connection. "The jungle remembers everything." Marcus sat up, instantly alert. This wasn't the gentle guidance he'd grown accustomed to, the subtle nudges that had led him to the missing hikers, then to Sofia Hernandez. This was something else entirely. "Who is this?" he demanded into the handset, but only Static answered. He'd made enemies during his missionary years. That much was certain. The work in Colombia had been dangerous, the line between salvation and politics impossibly thin. But he thought that part of his life was buried, along with the choices that had driven him from the church and into the bottle. The next morning brought news that made his stomach churn. Captain Reyes appeared at his door with coffee and a grim expression. "There's been another disappearance," she said, settling into the room's only chair. "But this one's different." Marcus poured himself coffee with hands that shook slightly. "Different how?" "The missing person specifically asked for you, by name." Reyes studied his face carefully. "Dr. Elena Vasquez." an anthropologist studying indigenous communities up the Rio Javari. Her research station went silent 4 days ago. When her team was found, they said she'd received a message telling her to wait for the man who saves the lost. The coffee turned bitter in Marcus's mouth. The Rio Javari was deep jungle, close to the Peruvian border, territory he knew too well from his missionary days. It was also some of the most dangerous country in the Amazon, controlled by cartels, illegal miners, and worse. "There's more," Reyes continued. "The message mentioned your real name, Marcus Chen, formerly Father Marcus of the Sacred Heart Mission." Marcus set down his cup carefully. He'd been Marcus Cross for 5 years now, ever since he'd walked away from everything he'd once believed in. The fact that someone knew his true identity meant they knew about Colombia, about the choices he'd made in the name of protecting his flock. "I can't take this case," he said quietly. "Why not?" But Reyes's eyes suggested she already suspected. Before Marcus could answer, his satellite phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "She's innocent, but she knows what you did. Save her, and perhaps save yourself." The familiar chill ran down his spine, the same sensation he'd felt when being guided to the other rescues. But this time it was tainted with something darker, more urgent. Reyes noticed his expression change. "What is it?" Marcus showed her the message. She frowned, then pulled out her own phone and showed him a photograph. Dr. Elena Vasquez was a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and graying hair. She reminded him painfully of Sister Catherine, the nun who died because of his choices in Colombia. "The helicopter can have you at her last known location by noon," Reyes said. "But Marcus, if this is connected to your past, you need to tell me what we're walking into." Marcus stared at the photograph. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to disappear into the anonymous crowds of Sao Paulo or Lima, but the voice that had guided him to save others was now calling in a debt, and he could feel the weight of Dr. Vasquez's life hanging in the balance. "In Colombia, I wasn't just a missionary," he began slowly. "The Sacred Heart Mission was in FARC territory. We were supposed to minister to the local indigenous communities, but..." He paused, the words sticking in his throat like thorns. "The cartels were using the river routes to move product. They wanted to use our mission as a way station. I said no." Marcus's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "So they took Sister Catherine and 3 of our local converts hostage." Reyes waited, understanding that some confessions couldn't be rushed. "The army wanted to raid the cartel compound, but I knew they'd kill the hostages the moment they saw soldiers coming. So, I made a deal." Marcus's hands clenched into fists. "I gave the military intelligence about cartel movements in exchange for a precision strike. Told myself it was the only way to save innocent lives. What happened? The strike worked. The hostages were saved, but 37 people died in that compound, including women and children who had nothing to do with the drug trade." Marcus met her eyes. "I broke my vows, compromised everything I believed in, and got people killed. That's what I've been running from." Reyes was quiet for a long moment. Finally, she asked, "Do you think Dr. Vasquez knows about Colombia?" Marcus's phone buzzed again. "Time is running out. The jungle has been waiting for you to return." "I think," Marcus said, already reaching for his gear, "that's exactly what we're about to find out." The morning mist clung to the river like smoke from dying embers as Marcus paddled deeper into the Amazon's heart. 3 days had passed since leaving the trading post, and the cryptic voice in his head had grown stronger, more insistent. "Follow the broken tree. The child waits where the water turns black." He'd learned not to question these whispers anymore, not after finding Elena Vasquez exactly where the voice had promised. The grateful tears of her family still haunted him, a reminder of why he'd abandoned his collar for this dangerous calling. But something felt different this time. The voice carried an urgency that made his skin crawl. The broken tree appeared around a bend, a massive cecropia split by lightning, its hollow trunk forming a natural archway over a tributary. Marcus steered his canoe into the darker waters, noting how the vegetation grew denser here, more primal. Orchids bloomed in impossible colors, while somewhere in the canopy, howler monkeys announced his intrusion. His satellite phone buzzed. No signal this deep, but the device showed a single message received hours ago. Stop looking for what you'll never find. H. Marcus's blood chilled. Heinrich. After 12 years of silence, his former colleague from the mission had found him. The man who'd destroyed everything Marcus had once believed in, who'd turned their sacred work into something unspeakable. The reason Marcus had fled Brazil the first time. The child needs you now. The voice cut through his spiraling thoughts, calmer than his racing heart. Trust me. A splash echoed from ahead. Marcus raised his paddle, letting the current carry him silently forward. Through the dense curtain of hanging vines, he spotted movement. A small figure crouched on a muddy bank, frantically washing something in the black water. The missing boy. Carlos Mendoza, age 7, vanished from a research station 4 days ago. But as Marcus drew closer, he noticed the child's strange behavior. Carlos wasn't washing clothes or himself. He was methodically cleaning what looked like carved wooden figures, his movements mechanical and repetitive. "Carlos?" Marcus called softly. The boy's head snapped up, revealing hollow eyes that seemed far too old for his face. He clutched the wooden figures protectively against his chest. "They told me to clean them," Carlos whispered, "every day. Until the bad men go away." Marcus beached his canoe and approached slowly, hands visible. "Who told you to clean them, son?" "The voices. They keep me safe." Carlos's fingers traced intricate patterns carved into the wooden figurines, symbols Marcus recognized with growing dread. Ancient protection glyphs from the old tribes, the same ones Heinrich had studied obsessively during their time at the mission. He's been preparing. The voice in Marcus's head carried a note of respect, almost fondness. "Clever child. Carlos, I'm going to take you home to your family." Marcus knelt beside the boy. "But first, can you tell me who brought you here?" "The pale man." He said the voices lied to him, but they speak truth to me. Carlos studied Marcus with unsettling intensity. "They speak to you too. I can see it." A branch snapped in the forest behind them. Marcus spun, hand instinctively reaching for the knife on his belt. Through the green shadows, a figure emerged, tall, gaunt, with prematurely white hair and skin marked by jungle diseases. Heinrich looked like death walking. "Marcus." The German's accent had thickened over the years. "You always did have a gift for finding the lost ones." "Let the boy go, Heinrich. Whatever this is about." "This is about the voices, old friend." Heinrich's smile revealed teeth stained brown with decay. "The ones you pretend not to hear, the ones that led you to me." Carlos pressed closer to Marcus, still clutching his wooden protectors. He tried to make them speak to him, but they wouldn't. They don't like him. Heinrich's face darkened. 20 years I've searched for the source. The tribes speak of forest spirits, ancient guardians who choose their vessels. You were chosen, Marcus. Even during our mission work, I saw how they guided you to the villages that needed help most. You're insane. Aye. How else do you explain your success rate? 7 missing persons found in 2 months, all in places no rational search would consider. Heinrich stepped closer, and Marcus caught the stench of fever, sweat, and madness. The boy was bait. I needed to study how they communicate, how they choose. Run. The voice exploded through Marcus's consciousness with desperate urgency. Take the child and run, now. But Heinrich was already moving, pulling something from his jacket, not a weapon, but a carved mask identical to the ones Carlos clutched. As he raised it toward his face, the jungle itself seemed to recoil. I've learned to make them listen, Heinrich breathed. The moment the mask touched his skin, the forest erupted in screams, both human and something far older. The coordinates led Marcus deeper into the Amazon than he'd ever ventured, past the last outposts of civilization where even the most hardened river traders refused to go. His guide, a weathered Yanomami man named Kaikori, had grown increasingly silent as they traveled upstream, his dark eyes scanning the jungle canopy with an unease that made Marcus's skin crawl. Bad spirits here, Kaikori muttered, the first words he'd spoken in hours. The trees remember blood. Marcus checked his GPS again, though the device had been losing signal intermittently for the past day. The coordinates from the voice matched perfectly with the location where Dr. Sarah Chen's research team had last transmitted their position 3 weeks ago. But something felt different about this rescue mission. The voice in his head had been quiet since yesterday, leaving him with an uncomfortable silence that felt like abandonment. They rounded a bend in the river, and Kaikori suddenly cut the motor. Ahead, partially hidden by hanging vines and twisted mangrove roots, stood the skeletal remains of a research station. Solar panels hung at broken angles, and equipment boxes floated lazily in the muddy water around the stilted platform. "We should not go there," Kaikori whispered, backing the boat away from the current. "The jungle has claimed it." But Marcus was already studying the scene, his investigator instincts overriding his guide's superstitions. No bodies, no obvious signs of violence, just abandonment, as if the team had simply vanished mid-task. He'd seen this before, in Guatemala, in the Congo, in places where his mysterious benefactor had sent him to find the lost. "Wait here," Marcus said, checking his machete and the pistol at his hip. "If I'm not back in 2 hours, leave without me." Kaikori's eyes widened. "I cannot leave you here. The spirits can go to hell," Marcus snapped, then immediately regretted his harshness. His old missionary training kicked in, reminding him of the respect he owed to indigenous beliefs. "I'm sorry, I have to find these people." He waded through the shallow water to the research platform, noting how the jungle had already begun to reclaim the human intrusion. Vines snaked through broken windows, and a family of small monkeys had made themselves at home among the scattered scientific instruments. Inside the main lab, Marcus found Dr. Chen's journal, its pages water-stained but still readable. Her final entry, dated 3 weeks ago, sent a chill down his spine. "The local shamans were right. We never should have come to this place. The excavation site is wrong." Tom heard voices last night, calling him toward the pit. Sarah M. followed the sounds this morning and didn't come back. The others are talking about leaving, but something won't let us go. It's like the jungle itself is holding us here. I keep hearing whispers in languages I don't recognize but somehow understand. They're saying something about a debt that must be paid. Marcus pocketed the journal and followed a barely visible trail leading away from the station. The path wound through increasingly dense vegetation, past trees that seemed to lean inward, blocking out the sun. The air grew thick and oppressive, carrying scents of decay and something else, something ancient and metallic like old copper pennies. The trail ended at a circular clearing where the research team had been excavating what appeared to be pre-Columbian ruins. But these weren't like any indigenous architecture Marcus had studied during his missionary years. The stone blocks were massive, precisely cut, and covered with symbols that seemed to writhe and shift when he looked at them directly. In the center of the clearing sat a pit, perhaps 20 feet across, descending into absolute darkness. Equipment lay scattered around its edge as if dropped in haste, and there, tied to stakes driven deep into the ground, were 5 people in various states of dehydration and delirium. "Jesus Christ," Marcus breathed, rushing to the nearest figure, a young woman whose research badge identified her as Dr. Sarah Chen herself. She was alive, barely conscious, mumbling incoherently about voices and ancient debts. As he cut her bonds, the voice finally returned to his mind, clearer and more urgent than ever before. "Do not free them all. Not yet. You must choose." "Choose what?" Marcus said aloud, earning a confused look from the semi-conscious scientist. 3 may leave. 2 must remain. The balance must be maintained. That's insane. I'm taking all of them." Marcus moved to the next captive, a bearded man who appeared to be the team's geologist. The temperature in the clearing dropped 10 degrees in an instant. The symbols on the ancient stones began to glow with a sickly green phosphorescence, and from deep within the pit came a sound like grinding stone and distant screaming. "You have been chosen for this purpose, Marcus Thorne, as were the others before you. The debt you incurred in Rwanda will be forgiven if you serve Marcus's hands froze on the rope, binding the geologist. Rwanda. The voice knew about Rwanda. The canoe cut through black water like a blade through silk, barely disturbing the mirror surface that reflected the star-drunk sky above. Marcus gripped the weathered paddle, his knuckles white against the wood as Father Benedito guided them deeper into the Amazon's arterial maze. The old priest's silhouette hunched forward, his movements economical and practiced. "How much farther?" Marcus whispered, though he wasn't sure why he kept his voice low. The jungle around them pulsed with its own symphony. The distant howl of howler monkeys, the splash of something large breaking the surface behind them, the rustle of unseen creatures in the canopy overhead. "Not far now," Benedito replied, his voice carrying the weight of decades spent navigating these waters. "The village where your friend was taken lies just beyond the next bend." Marcus's chest tightened. Elena, bright, determined Elena who'd insisted on accompanying him this far into the green hell. He should have sent her back to Manaus when he had the chance. Should have known that whoever had been orchestrating his recent cases wouldn't leave loose ends untied. The cryptic message had arrived 3 days ago, scratched onto the bark of a cecropia tree outside their camp. The shepherd seeks his flock where shadows dance with light. Another puzzle piece in the increasingly complex game he'd been unwittingly playing. Each rescue mission over the past months had led him deeper into the Amazon, following breadcrumbs left by an invisible hand. A low branch scraped against Marcus's shoulder, and he flinched. The jungle seemed to press closer with each passing hour, as if the very trees were conspiring to trap him. Father Benedito raised his hand, signaling for silence. Through the curtain of hanging moss and twisted vines, Marcus could see the faint glow of firelight. Voices carried across the water, harsh, unfamiliar syllables that made his blood run cold. Not Portuguese, not any of the indigenous languages he'd learned during his missionary years. They beached the canoe on a muddy bank tangled with roots. Benedito moved with surprising agility for his age, securing the vessel while Marcus checked his gear. The Glock felt reassuring against his hip, though he hoped it wouldn't come to violence. Too often lately it had. There, Benedito pointed through the undergrowth, the old processing station, abandoned for years or so we thought. Marcus could make out the skeletal remains of buildings through the green wall, concrete and rusted metal that spoke of failed dreams and corporate retreat. Perfect cover for whatever operation had taken Elena. They crept forward, every footstep calculated to avoid the brittle twigs and dry leaves that would betray their presence. The voices grew clearer, and Marcus's Portuguese finally caught fragments of meaning. Something about a schedule, about moving cargo before dawn. His blood turned to ice when he heard Elena's voice, defiant even in captivity. "You can't keep doing this. Someone will come looking." A harsh laugh followed, then the sound of a blow landing. Marcus's hand moved instinctively to his weapon, but Benedito's weathered fingers closed over his wrist. "Patience," the priest whispered. "Anger serves no one here." Through a gap in the corrugated metal wall, Marcus could see into the main building. Elena sat tied to a chair in the center of a circle of armed men, mercenaries by their look, hard-faced and professional. But it was the figure standing in the shadows that made Marcus's world tilt sideways. Samuel Voss stepped into the firelight, and 20 years collapsed into nothing. The same pale eyes, the same thin smile that had haunted Marcus's nightmares. The man who'd turned Marcus's mission work into something darker, who de-used the trust of indigenous communities to line his own pockets. The man Marcus had thought died in the fire that consumed the San Miguel compound all those years ago. "She's quite spirited," Voss was saying, circling Elena like a predator, though not nearly as resourceful as her employer. "Tell me, my dear, do you know the real reason Father Martinez has been so successful at finding lost souls?" Elena's chin lifted defiantly. "He helps people. Something you wouldn't understand." Voss chuckled, a sound like glass grinding against stone. "Oh, but I understand perfectly. You see, I've been helping him all along. Every cryptic message, every mysterious clue, all carefully crafted to bring him exactly where I needed him to be. The truth hit Marcus like a physical blow. The voice that had guided him, that he'd sometimes wondered might be divine intervention, it had been Voss all along. Every rescue, every life saved, had been part of some larger game. 20 years I've waited, Voss continued. 20 years to settle accounts with my former partner. Though I suspect our father Martinez never told you about his past indiscretions, did he? About the villages that burned? The people who died because of his choices? Marcus closed his eyes, memories flooding back unbidden. The smell of smoke, the sound of screaming, the weight of decisions that had damned him long before he'd ever picked up a badge. Benedito's hand squeezed his shoulder. The past is past, the old priest whispered. What matters now is what you choose to do. The machete felt foreign in Marcus's hands as he hacked through another wall of green. 3 days had passed since they'd left the village, and the jungle seemed determined to reclaim every step of their progress. Sweat stung his eyes, mixing with the humidity that pressed against them like a living thing. "We're close," Esperanza said from behind him, her voice barely audible over the symphony of insects and distant howler monkeys. She consulted the GPS device that had somehow maintained its signal despite the thick canopy above. "The coordinates are just ahead." Marcus paused, wiping his forehead with the back of his hand. The voice that had guided him for so long remained silent, leaving only the crushing weight of uncertainty. Whatever awaited them at those coordinates, whatever connection existed between his past and Sarah Chen's disappearance, he was walking into it blind. A flash of yellow caught his eye through the undergrowth. Fabric. He pushed forward more urgently, branches tearing at his shirt as he fought through the vegetation. Behind him, Esperanza's breathing grew labored as she struggled to keep pace. The jungle opened into a small clearing dominated by the skeletal remains of what had once been a research station. Solar panels hung at odd angles from rusted frames, and a communications antenna lay twisted among the roots of a massive cecropia tree. Nature was already reclaiming the structures, vines threading through broken windows and moss carpeting the metal surfaces. Estacal de Pesquisa São Gabriel, Esperanza read from a faded sign near the entrance. "I've heard of this place. It was abandoned years ago after some kind of accident." Marcus approached the main building, his skin prickling with recognition. The layout, the positioning of the structures, it matched fragments of memories he'd tried to bury. Memories of his time with the mission, of the research they'd conducted in secret, of the indigenous communities they'd claimed to help while documenting something else entirely. Inside the main structure, equipment lay scattered across the floor, covered in dust and debris. Computer monitors with cracked screens stared blindly from metal desks, and filing cabinets stood open, their contents long since claimed by the humidity. But in the corner, partially hidden beneath a tarp, Marcus found what he was looking for. Sarah Chen's equipment bag, her laptop somehow still functional, displayed a single document on its screen, a research paper titled Shamanic Communication Networks and Quantum Consciousness Fields. The cursor blinked at the end of an incomplete sentence. The voice phenomenon appears to be, "She was investigating the same thing you experienced," Esperanza said, reading over his shoulder. "The guidance, the messages." Marcus scrolled through the document, his chest tightening with each paragraph. Sarah had been tracking patterns of inexplicable guidance among indigenous communities throughout the Amazon. Shamans who received precise information about lost travelers, hunters who found missing children by following dreams, and at the center of it all, references to the work conducted at this very station 15 years ago. His work. A sound from outside froze them both, the unmistakable crack of a branch beneath heavy footsteps. Marcus motioned for Esperanza to stay quiet as he moved to the window. Through the grimy glass, he could see movement in the tree line. Multiple figures, dressed in dark clothing despite the heat, moving with the precision of military training. "They found us," Esperanza whispered. Marcus's mind raced through their options. The research station had no back exit and they were outnumbered. But as he watched the figures position themselves around the clearing, something else caught his attention. a glint of metal from the communications tower. The equipment wasn't as dead as it appeared. Someone had been maintaining it, keeping at least part of the station operational. And if Sarah's research was correct, if there was truly something here that could explain the voice that had guided him, then perhaps, "Follow my lead," he said, grabbing Sarah's laptop and moving toward the rear of the building. "There's something I need to try." The communications equipment was indeed functional, jury-rigged with newer components that hummed with electrical life. Marcus began working with the controls, his hands moving with muscle memory from his missionary days when radio communication had been their only link to the outside world. But instead of trying to call for help, he did something else entirely. He activated the equipment's listening mode, tuning it to frequencies that existed somewhere between conventional radio and something far more mysterious. Frequencies that he and his research team had accidentally discovered years ago while trying to document indigenous languages. Static filled the air, punctuated by distant voices speaking in languages he couldn't identify. And then, cutting through it all like a knife through silk, came the voice he'd been waiting for. Marcus. It spoke with perfect clarity, despite coming through decades-old equipment. "You understand now, the network exists. It has always existed. Sarah found it. Now she needs your help to navigate it." The footsteps outside grew closer, and Marcus realized they were out of time. The machete sliced through another curtain of vines as Marcus pushed deeper into territory that seemed to exist outside time itself. 3 days had passed since leaving the last settlement, following coordinates whispered by the voice during his fever dreams. The GPS had died yesterday, its screen flickering into permanent darkness, leaving only the compass and an inexplicable certainty that he was heading towards something inevitable. Elena walked behind him, her breathing labored but determined. She hadn't spoken much since their argument at the river crossing, when she demanded to know what he was really running from. How could he explain that he wasn't running from anything but towards something he couldn't name? The voice had been silent for hours now, leaving only the oppressive weight of the canopy above and the growing sense that every step forward was a step deeper into his own reckoning. "There," Elena gasped, pointing through a gap in the foliage. "Smoke." Marcus stopped, wiping sweat from his eyes. A thin grey column rose in the distance, barely visible against the pewter sky. But something about it felt wrong, too straight, too deliberate. The indigenous communities they'd encountered used fires for cooking and warmth, sending up chaotic spirals that danced with the wind. This smoke rose like a beacon, unwavering and purposeful. "That's not a cooking fire," he said, checking his weapon out of habit. Elena moved beside him, her face drawn with exhaustion. "The missing anthropologists?" Marcus shook his head. In his gut, he knew they wouldn't find Dr. Santos and her team at the source of that smoke. This was something else entirely. The voice had led him here for a different reason, one that made his chest tighten with familiar dread. They approached through dense undergrowth, moving as quietly as possible. The smoke grew thicker, carrying an acrid smell that reminded Marcus of burned offerings from his missionary days. Through the trees, he glimpsed the edge of a clearing where several structures stood in a rough circle around a central fire pit. But these weren't traditional shelters. Corrugated metal sheets had been fashioned into lean-tos, and plastic tarps stretched between trees created makeshift walls. It looked like a temporary camp, the kind used by people who didn't plan to stay long but needed to establish a base of operations. "Drug runners?" Elena whispered. Marcus studied the camp more carefully. No guards were visible, but several figures moved between the structures with the purposeful efficiency of people following a routine. One man emerged from the largest shelter, and Marcus's blood turned to ice water. Father Vicente Morales, 20 years older, his black hair now silver, his face weathered by decades in the jungle, but unmistakably the man who had once been Marcus's mentor, his confessor, his trusted superior in the mission. The man who had sent him into the village of San Miguel with orders that still haunted his dreams. "We need to leave," Marcus said, backing away from the clearing. But Elena grabbed his arm. "Wait, look." 3 figures sat near the fire pit, their hands bound behind their backs. 2 women and a man, all wearing the khaki field clothes favored by researchers. Dr. Santos and her team, alive but clearly captives. Marcus's mind raced. The voice had led him here, but why? To rescue the anthropologists or to face Vicente? The 2 objectives seemed impossible to reconcile. His former superior commanded a dozen armed men by Marcus's count, and approaching the camp would be suicide. "Do you know him?" Elena asked, studying Marcus's face. "The older man giving orders?" Marcus nodded slowly. "Father Vicente Morales. He runs medical missions throughout the Amazon basin, officially and unofficially." The question hung in the humid air, like the smoke from Vicente's fire. Marcus had spent 20 years trying to forget what he'd learned about the priest's unofficial activities. The indigenous children who disappeared from the missions. The young women who were promised education and medical care but never returned to their families. The systematic exploitation hidden beneath the veneer of Christian charity. "He collects people," Marcus said finally. "Sells them to anyone willing to pay. Labor camps, brothels, experimental medical facilities." The anthropologists probably stumbled onto one of his operations. Elena's face went pale. "And you worked for him?" "I worked with him. There's a difference." But even as he said it, Marcus knew the distinction was meaningless. He had followed Vicente's orders, trusted his guidance, participated in his mission. The voice that had been guiding him these past months, had it led him here to finally confront that complicity? As if summoned by his thoughts, Vicente looked directly toward their hiding place. His weathered face broke into a smile, and he called out in Spanish, his voice carrying clearly across the clearing. "Marcus Thorne, I was wondering when you'd arrive. Please come join us. We have much to discuss, and I believe you'll find our conversation illuminating." The priest gestured toward the bound anthropologists. "Your friends here have been asking about you. Apparently, someone's been sending them messages claiming you could help them. Isn't that fascinating?" Marcus felt the weight of 20 years of guilt settle on his shoulders like the humid jungle air. The voice came to Marcus in fragments now, like radio static breaking through atmospheric interference. Each word arrived with the weight of desperate urgency, and he could feel something fundamental shifting in the invisible connection that had guided him for months. The children, North Ridge, before dawn. Marcus pressed his palms against his temples, trying to piece together the broken transmission. Around him, the Amazon breathed its humid whispers, and somewhere in the distance, howler monkeys announced the approaching night. He'd been walking for 6 hours since leaving the crashed plane wreckage where he'd found Elena Santos. Alive but traumatized, another successful rescue that should have felt like victory. Instead, each rescue now felt like a step deeper into a maze he couldn't see. "Where are you?" he whispered to the darkness gathering between the trees. "Who are you?" The silence that followed felt different from before. Not the comfortable quiet of a presence listening, but the hollow echo of abandonment. Marcus had grown accustomed to the weight of being watched, guided, protected by something beyond his understanding. Now that weight was lifting, and he realized how much he'd come to depend on it. His satellite phone crackled. "Marcus, this is Rodriguez. You need to get back to the extraction point now." Marcus lifted the device. "I'm not done here. There are others." "That's an order. We have intelligence suggesting Vasquez's people are moving toward your position. Whatever you're chasing out there, it's not worth your life." But Marcus knew Rodriguez was wrong. The voice had been leading him toward something crucial, something that connected all these disappearances. The rescued missionaries, the missing anthropologists, the children taken from remote villages. They weren't random victims. They were pieces of a pattern he was only beginning to understand. The clearing, where it all began. The fragment hit him like a physical blow, and suddenly Marcus knew exactly where he needed to go. The abandoned mission station where he'd worked 15 years ago, before everything fell apart. Before the night that drove him from the church and into a decade of running from God and himself. He clicked off the radio without responding to Rodriguez and adjusted his pack. The mission station was 8 miles north, through terrain that would be treacherous in daylight and potentially deadly in darkness. But if the voice was right, if the children were there, he couldn't wait for dawn. As he moved through the jungle, memories surfaced like bubbles from deep water. The mission station had been his first assignment, full of hope and certainty about his purpose. He'd been younger then, convinced that faith and good intentions could overcome any obstacle. The indigenous community had welcomed him cautiously, and over months he'd built relationships, learned their language, started to understand their struggles. Then came the night when rebels had attacked the village. Marcus had hidden in the church while families were torn apart, children screaming as they were dragged into the darkness. He'd had a radio, could have called for help earlier, but fear had paralyzed him until it was too late. By the time rescue arrived, 7 children were gone, and Marcus's faith lay in ashes. The guilt had consumed him. He'd left the mission field, abandoned his calling, and spent years trying to forget the sound of those children crying for help that never came. You couldn't have saved them then. The voice was clearer now, as if proximity to the old mission was strengthening their connection. But you can save them now. Marcus stopped walking. They're dead. Those children died years ago. Did they? The question sent ice through his veins. Intel reports had confirmed the children's deaths, but Marcus realized he'd never seen bodies, never had absolute proof. He'd accepted the loss because living with uncertainty felt worse than living with failure. Through the canopy ahead, he could see the pale concrete walls of the mission station emerging from 15 years of jungle reclamation. Vines had claimed the bell tower and the roof had partially collapsed, but the structure remained. More importantly, he could see the faint glow of artificial light through the broken windows. Marcus approached carefully, using cover techniques he'd learned in his investigator years. The main building showed signs of recent habitation, cleared pathways, repair work on the walls, new locks on doors that should have rotted away long ago. Someone had been using this place. As he crept closer to a window, voices drifted from inside. Children's voices, speaking the indigenous language he'd struggled to learn 15 years ago. But these weren't ghost voices or memories. They were real, immediate, alive. Marcus peered through a gap in the boards covering the window and felt his world reorganize around what he saw. A dozen children of various ages sat in the old chapel, supervised by 2 armed men. Some of the children looked too old to be the ones taken during the attack, but others... His heart stopped. A girl he recognized, impossibly older but unmistakably the same face that had haunted his nightmares. She was alive. They were all alive. The radio crackled to life at 3:17 a.m., jolting Marcus from his restless sleep. Static filled the humid air of his makeshift shelter, then cleared to reveal that familiar voice, the one that had guided him through 7 impossible rescues across 3 continents. The children are 2 days ahead, following the old mining trail. But Santiago knows you're coming. Marcus sat up, sweat beading on his forehead despite the morning chill. Santiago Velez, the name he'd hoped never to hear again, the ghost from his missionary days that had haunted every step of this journey. Now he understood why the voice had led him here, to this forgotten corner of the Amazon where the trees grew so thick that satellites couldn't penetrate their canopy. He'd been hunting the missing Delacroix children for 6 weeks, following cryptic radio transmissions that somehow always proved accurate. The twins, Emma and Thomas, aged 8 and 10, had vanished from their parents' research station near the Colombian border. Local authorities had given up after 2 weeks, declaring the jungle too dangerous and the children presumed dead. But the voice knew better. It always did. Marcus packed his gear methodically, muscle memory from his military days taking over, water purification tablets, emergency medical supplies, the GPS tracker that had been useless for the past 3 days. The voice had warned him technology would fail here, where the old spirits still held sway. As he shouldered his pack, the radio whispered again, "He's not the same man you knew 15 years ago. The jungle changed him, just as it changed you. "I'm nothing like Santiago," Marcus muttered, but his words felt hollow in the dense air. The mining trail was barely visible, overgrown with vines and littered with rusted equipment from abandoned operations. Marcus moved carefully, reading the signs the jungle offered: broken twigs, disturbed earth, the faint scent of wood smoke carried on the wind. Someone had passed this way recently, someone who knew how to move quietly but couldn't completely erase their presence. By midday, he'd found the first camp, cigarette butts scattered around a cold fire pit, the paper still dry enough to suggest they'd been smoked within the last 48 hours. Spanish brands, expensive ones. Santiago always did have particular tastes. The voice found him again, as he knelt examining boot prints in the soft earth. The children are unharmed. He's keeping them alive for a reason. "What reason?" Marcus asked aloud, feeling foolish for talking to empty air. Only static answered. He pressed deeper into the jungle, following game trails that crisscrossed the mining road. The trees here were ancient giants, their trunks scarred by decades of violence, bullet holes from the drug wars, machete marks from desperate refugees, burn scars from fires set by those who wanted to hide their crimes. Marcus knew this place, not these specific coordinates, but the feeling of it, the weight of accumulated secrets pressing down through the canopy. He'd felt it before, 15 years ago, when he'd stood in Santiago's church and realized the man he'd called brother had been selling children to traffickers. The confrontation had been swift and brutal. Marcus had presented the evidence, expecting confession and repentance. Instead, Santiago had pulled a gun and opened fire during Sunday service. 3 parishioners died in the crossfire before Marcus managed to disarm him. Santiago had escaped into the jungle that day, and Marcus had left South America forever, trading his missionary's cross for a private investigator's license. He'd told himself he was done with saving souls. From now on, he'd stick to saving lives. But the voice had other plans. It had started with simple cases: missing hikers in Montana, a kidnapped businessman in Bangkok, a runaway teenager in Prague. Each time, the radio transmissions guided him to success, providing information no earthly intelligence network could have gathered. Marcus stopped questioning the source after the 3rd rescue, when the voice led him to a sex trafficking ring and saved 17 children. Now, tracking through this green hell, he wondered if every case had been building to this moment. 7 rescues, 7 chances to prove himself worthy of facing the darkness he'd fled 15 years ago. The second camp was abandoned but warm, cooking fires still smoldering. Santiago was moving faster now, probably aware he was being followed. But he was also heading deeper into the jungle, away from any possible escape routes. It felt like a trap, or maybe an invitation. The radio crackled. "Trust me, Marcus. Trust what you've learned." As afternoon shadows lengthened through the trees, Marcus found fresh boot prints, adult size 11s alongside 2 smaller sets. The children were walking on their own, not being carried, a good sign or calculated mercy from a man who'd already proven capable of murder. The trail led toward a wall of green so dense it seemed impenetrable, but Marcus found the hidden entrance, a gap between 2 massive cecropia trees that looked natural but had been carefully maintained. Beyond lay Santiago's sanctuary, and somewhere within it, 2 children who needed saving. Marcus checked his weapon and stepped into the shadows. The sound of rushing water grew louder as Marcus pushed through the dense undergrowth, following the coordinates that had appeared in his mind like burning letters. Behind him, Elena and Dr. Santos struggled to keep pace. Their breathing labored in the humid air. The voice had been silent for hours now, leaving only that inexplicable certainty of direction that had become his unwanted compass. "There," Elena gasped, pointing through a break in the canopy. "I can see it!" The research station materialized from the green chaos like a forgotten memory made manifest. Solar panels glinted dully on corrugated roofs, and Marcus could make out the skeletal remains of radio equipment twisted among the vines that had begun their slow reclamation. But what stopped him cold was the figure moving between the buildings, deliberate, purposeful, alive. Dr. Santos grabbed Marcus's arm. That's impossible. The station was abandoned 3 years ago. Marcus studied the distant figure through his binoculars. Male, elderly, wearing the tattered remains of what might once have been expedition clothing. The man moved with the careful precision of someone who had learned to survive in isolation, checking equipment, tending to what appeared to be a small garden carved from the jungle floor. "We go in slowly," Marcus said, though every instinct screamed at him to turn back. This felt too much like the trap he'd been expecting, the final move in whatever game had been orchestrating his life for months. They approached the station's perimeter just as the sun began its rapid descent toward the horizon. The man, if that's what he truly was, stood waiting for them at the main building's entrance. Up close, Marcus could see the intelligence burning in pale eyes, set deep in a weathered face marked by years of solitude. "You're the investigator," the man said, his voice carrying a slight accent Marcus couldn't place. "The one who finds the lost ones. Who are you?" Marcus kept his hand near the pistol holstered beneath his jacket, though he sensed the gesture was meaningless here. "Dr. Heinrich Voss. I was the station director before..." The old man gestured vaguely at the jungle surrounding them. "Before I understood the true nature of my research." Elena stepped forward. "The missing expedition members. Are they here? Are they alive?" Voss's laugh held no humor. "Alive? That depends entirely on how one defines the term." He turned and walked into the building, clearly expecting them to follow. The interior had been maintained with obsessive care. Equipment hummed quietly, powered by the solar array above. But it was the walls that made Marcus's blood run cold, covered floor to ceiling with photographs, maps, and documents connected by red thread in patterns that hurt to look at directly. At the center of it all was a large map marking locations across South America, each pin corresponding to a photograph of a missing person. "My God," Dr. Santos whispered. "These are all the disappearances from the last 5 years." "Not disappearances," Voss corrected. "Gatherings." Each person called for a specific purpose, guided by voices they couldn't ignore. His eyes fixed on Marcus. "Just as you were guided here." Marcus felt the familiar chill of recognition. Every photo on the wall showed someone with the same haunted expression he'd seen in mirrors. People who'd heard voices, followed impossible directions, made choices that defied rational explanation. "Where are they now?" he demanded. Voss moved to a door at the rear of the building. "See for yourself." The back room was empty except for a single chair facing a window that looked out into the jungle. But as Marcus approached the glass, the trees seemed to shift and part, revealing a path that descended into darkness, a natural formation that penetrated deep into the earth. "They went willingly," Voss said quietly, "once they understood what was being offered. The voice doesn't force, Mr. Kane. It reveals. It shows us what we truly are beneath the illusions we've constructed." "You're insane." "Am I?" "You followed that same voice across continents. You found people who should have been impossible to locate. You've survived situations that should have killed you." Voss stepped beside him at the window. "Tell me, in your deepest, most honest moments, don't you feel it calling you home?" The words hit Marcus like a physical blow because they echoed the longing that had been growing in his chest since he'd first heard the voice. The sense that somewhere in the darkness below lay answers to questions he'd been afraid to ask about himself, about the true reason he'd abandoned his mission work, about the guilt that had driven him into a profession built on redemption. "The others," Elena said from behind them. "What happened to the expedition members?" Voss smiled, and for the first time the expression seemed genuinely peaceful. "They found what they were looking for, what we're all looking for, whether we admit it or not." Outside, night fell with jungle swiftness, and Marcus could swear he heard something calling from the depths below, patient, eternal, and utterly certain of his eventual surrender. The voice came to him in the pre-dawn darkness, clearer than it had ever been before. "Walk to the fallen Cecropia, 20 paces northeast. Wait." Marcus opened his eyes to find himself alone. Isabella had vanished sometime during the night, leaving only a shallow depression in the earth where she had lain. No footprints led away from their shelter. It was as if she had simply dissolved into the jungle air. He should have felt betrayed, abandoned. Instead, a strange calm settled over him as he gathered his meager supplies and followed the voice's guidance. The fallen tree was exactly where it said it would be, its massive trunk creating a natural bridge across a narrow ravine he hadn't noticed in yesterday's chaos. As he waited, the jungle awakened around him. Howler monkeys announced the approaching dawn, while toucans called from the canopy above. The sounds should have been peaceful, but Marcus detected an underlying tension in the forest's symphony. Even the wildlife sensed that something was coming. "You always were punctual." Marcus spun toward the voice, not the ethereal whisper that had guided him for months, but a human voice, familiar. From the shadows between the trees stepped a man he hadn't seen in 15 years. "Hello, Marcus." Father Eduardo Santos smiled, but his eyes held no warmth. "You look surprised. Surely you suspected the truth by now." The revelation hit Marcus like a physical blow. Eduardo had aged well. His hair was silver now, his face lined, but his posture remained erect, authoritative. The same commanding presence that had once made him the most influential missionary in the region. "You've been dead for 15 years, Marcus said, his hand instinctively moving toward his knife. "Dead to you, perhaps. Dead to the church that cast me out." Eduardo stepped closer, his movements casual but predatory. "But very much alive, Marcus. Unlike those children." The words hung in the humid air between them. Marcus felt the familiar weight of guilt pressing down on his chest. But for the first time in years, he didn't buckle under it. "You killed them," Marcus said. "You burned down the mission. You let me believe. I let you believe what you needed to believe." Eduardo's smile widened. "Guilt is such a powerful motivator, isn't it? Look how far it's brought you, how perfectly it's guided your steps." Understanding crashed over Marcus in waves. The missing persons cases, the cryptic messages, the mysterious rescues that had brought him deeper and deeper into the jungle. It was you. All of it. The voice that's been whispering in your ear? Yes, that was me. Though I must say, you made it easy. You wanted so desperately to be guided, to be forgiven, to find some purpose for your pathetic existence. Eduardo circled him slowly. "Every rescue was real, Marcus. I'm not entirely without mercy. But each one brought you closer to this moment, to this place. Why?" The word came out as barely a whisper. "'Cause you know where it is." Eduardo stopped directly in front of him. "The evidence that would destroy me. The proof of what really happened at the mission. You took it with you when you fled, didn't you? Hidden it somewhere safe?" Marcus's mind raced. Eduardo was talking about the photographs, the ones Marcus had found in the ruins after the fire. Images that proved the children hadn't died in any accident, but had been murdered. Marcus had hidden them before fleeing into exile, too traumatized to understand their significance, too broken to seek justice. "I don't know what you're talking about." Eduardo's laugh was sharp and cold. "Oh, Marcus, even now you cling to your lies. Do you think I've spent 15 years orchestrating this reunion for my health? Those photographs are the only evidence linking me to their deaths. Without them, I'm just another devoted servant of God who lost his mission to tragedy." The jungle seemed to hold its breath. Even the insects had gone silent. "You want to know the beautiful irony?" Eduardo continued. "I never intended to kill them. They simply discovered my little side business, the antiquities smuggling the sacred artifacts I was liberating from ignorant tribes. But children talk, don't they? They ask inconvenient questions." Marcus felt rage building in his chest, pure and clean after years of self-loathing. "They trusted you, as did you, as did everyone." Eduardo's expression hardened. "Now, where are the photographs?" The voice came then, not Eduardo's manipulative whisper, but something else entirely. Something that seemed to rise from the very earth beneath his feet. "He lies. You know the truth. Remember, Marcus closed his eyes, and for the first time in 15 years, he allowed himself to truly remember that night. The real truth, not the twisted version his guilt had created. "No," he said, opening his eyes to meet Eduardo's gaze. "You're wrong about everything." Eduardo's confident smile faltered slightly. "What do you mean?" Marcus smiled grimly. "I mean, those children didn't die that night, and they're here." The convergence point lay ahead like a wound in the earth itself, a circular clearing where the canopy opened to reveal stars that seemed to pulse with unnatural rhythm. Marcus felt the pull stronger than ever, that familiar tug that had guided him through countless rescues, but now it carried an urgency that made his chest tight. Behind him, Elena's breathing was labored, her face pale in the moonlight filtering through the leaves. "The children are close," she whispered, pressing a hand to her side where blood had seeped through the makeshift bandage. "I can feel them." Marcus nodded, though something else gnawed at him. The voice that had whispered guidance for so many months had fallen silent since their encounter with Ramirez's men. The absence felt like losing a limb. He'd grown dependent on that otherworldly compass, and now he was navigating blind through the most crucial moment of his journey. They emerged into the clearing and Marcus stopped short. At its center stood a structure that defied explanation, part ruin, part living tree with stone walls that seemed to grow from massive roots. Vines covered surfaces carved with symbols that hurt to look at directly, as if the eye couldn't quite process their geometry. The missing children sat in a circle before the structure, their eyes closed, lips moving in perfect unison, though no sound emerged. "Dear God," Elena breathed. "What is this place?" Marcus approached slowly, his hand instinctively reaching for the cross he no longer wore. The children, 7 of them, ages ranging from perhaps 8 to 15, showed no awareness of their arrival. Their clothes were clean, their faces peaceful, but something fundamental was wrong. They sat too still, breathed too rhythmically, their synchronized lip movements creating an unsettling pantomime of prayer or incantation. "Children?" Marcus called softly. No response. As he stepped closer, the carvings on the ancient structure began to glow with a faint phosphorescence. The light pulsed in rhythm with the children's breathing, and Marcus realized with growing horror that they weren't just sitting in formation, they were connected to this place somehow, feeding it or being fed by it. "We have to wake them," Elena said, moving toward the nearest child, a girl with long black hair. "Wait," Marcus caught her arm. Something was emerging from the structure, not a person but a presence that made the air itself seem heavier. The voice, when it came, didn't originate from any single point, but seemed to arise from the earth, the trees, the very molecules of mist hanging in the clearing. "You have served well, Marcus Delacroix." The sound of his name spoken by that inhuman voice sent ice through his veins. Elena gasped, pressing closer to him, but Marcus found himself stepping forward despite every instinct screaming for retreat. "Who are you? What do you want with these children?" "I am what your kind have forgotten, what your churches buried beneath stories of angels and demons. I am the space between, neither light nor dark, but the necessity that makes both possible." The presence seemed to coalesce, taking on a vaguely humanoid shape composed of shadow and starlight. These children volunteered, as you volunteered, though you did not know it. Volunteered for what? To be conduits, to help lost souls find their way home. Every person you rescued, Marcus, every life you saved. You think that was your skill alone? Your penance for past sins? The being's laugh was like wind through ancient leaves. "You have been my instrument, guided by my voice, serving my purpose." The truth hit him like a physical blow. Every miraculous lead, every inexplicable hunch that had led him to missing persons, none of it had been divine inspiration or detective instinct. He'd been a puppet dancing to an alien will. "The children," Elena demanded, her voice shaking but fierce. "Let them go. They are not prisoners. They are partners in something greater than your small human concerns." As Marcus was a partner, though he chose to remain ignorant of our arrangement, Marcus looked at the peaceful faces of the children, saw in them an echo of his own journey. How many nights had he followed mysterious impulses, certain he was doing God's work? How many rescues had he completed while guided by whispers he'd attributed to conscience or intuition? "I never agreed to this," he said. "Did you not? When you knelt in that church in Sao Paulo, begging forgiveness for your failures in the mission field? When you promised to dedicate your life to saving others?" "I heard that prayer, Marcus. I answered it." The children's eyes opened in unison, and they turned to look at him with expressions of infinite calm. In their gaze, he saw himself reflected. The missionary who had lost faith, the investigator who had found purpose, the man who had spent years trying to balance scales he'd never understood. Elena grabbed his hand. "Whatever this thing is, we're not leaving without them." The being seemed to smile, though it had no face. "Then perhaps it's time you understood what salvation truly costs." The ancient tree towered above them like a cathedral spire, its massive trunk scarred with symbols that seemed to pulse with their own inner light. Marcus felt the weight of every step that had brought him to this moment, every cryptic message, every dangerous rescue, every whispered guidance that had led him deeper into the Amazon's heart. Father Santos lay propped against the tree's base, his weathered face pale but alert. The bullet wound in his shoulder had been hastily bandaged, but blood still seeped through the makeshift dressing. Around them, the jungle breathed with an otherworldly presence that made Marcus's skin crawl with recognition. "You hear it too, don't you?" Santos whispered, his eyes fixed on something beyond the canopy. "The voice that brought you here." Marcus knelt beside his former mentor, the man whose trust he had shattered 15 years ago through greed and betrayal. The irony wasn't lost on him that their reunion had come at the cost of violence. Reyes and his men now lay motionless among the undergrowth, victims of forces Marcus still couldn't fully comprehend. "I've been hearing it for months," Marcus admitted. "Every case, every rescue. It guided me to Elena Vasquez in the mountains, to the missing children in Bolivia. I thought I was losing my mind." Santos managed a weak smile. "Madness and revelation often wear the same face, my son. This place," he gestured weakly at the towering tree. "The indigenous peoples call it the heart of voices. They believe it's where the boundary between worlds grows thin." A sound echoed through the clearing. Not quite wind, not quite speech, but something that resonated in Marcus's bones. The same presence that had whispered coordinates in his dreams, that had warned him of hidden dangers, that had somehow orchestrated every step of his journey. "Why me?" Marcus asked, though he wasn't sure if he was addressing Santos or the invisible presence itself. "After everything I've done, why was I chosen for this?" "Perhaps," Santos said, his breathing growing labored, "redemption isn't about deserving it. Perhaps it's about accepting it when it's offered." The air around them shimmered, and Marcus felt rather than saw a shift in the atmosphere. The oppressive weight of the jungle seemed to lift, replaced by something that felt almost like peace. In that moment of clarity, he understood that every rescue, every dangerous journey had been preparation for this confrontation. Not just with his past, but with himself. Santos's hand found his. "The people you saved, they were never the true mission, were they? They were stepping stones, teaching you to trust again, to believe in something beyond your own guilt." Marcus thought of Elena, safely reunited with her family. The children in Bolivia, now back in their village. The countless others whose paths had crossed his in moments of desperate need. Each rescue had chipped away at the armor of cynicism he'd built around his heart. "I need to get you medical attention," Marcus said. But Santos shook his head. "My journey ends here, as it was meant to. But yours," Santos squeezed his hand with surprising strength, "yours is just beginning. The voice that guided you here, it speaks for those who have no voice. The lost, the forgotten, the ones who slipped through the cracks of the world." A sudden clarity washed over Marcus. The cryptic messages hadn't been random. They'd been a calling. Not to any conventional faith, but to something deeper, a purpose that transcended his past mistakes and failures. The jungle around them seemed to exhale, and Marcus felt the presence withdrawing, not abandoning him, but settling into a quiet partnership. He understood now that he would continue to hear the voice, continued to receive the mysterious guidance that had brought him here. But the desperate uncertainty was gone, replaced by acceptance. Santos closed his eyes, his breathing evening out. "There's a radio in my pack. Call for extraction." And Marcus, his voice grew fainter. "Trust the voice. It led you through darkness to find light. It will again." As the sun filtered through the canopy above, Marcus activated the emergency beacon that would bring help. He thought about the life waiting for him beyond this place, no longer running from his past, but carrying it as part of his story. The voice had taught him that redemption wasn't about erasing mistakes, but about using them to better serve others. He looked up at the ancient tree one last time, its carved symbols now seeming less alien and more like a script he was beginning to understand. Somewhere in the distance, he could hear the sound of an approaching helicopter, but he felt no urgency. The real rescue had already taken place, not of Santos, but of something in himself he'd thought was lost forever. The voice whispered one final time, wordless but clear in its meaning, "Go. Serve. Listen." Marcus smiled, finally understanding that his greatest mystery had been solved not through investigation but through surrender.